There was no nursery, no hospital, no due date circled on a calendar. What does it mean to be a mother? Today, the word conjures images of warmth, softness, choice. A world of prenatal vitamins, ultrasound photographs taped to refrigerators, and carefully curated birth plans. We have built an entire culture around the idea that motherhood is something that can be prepared for, managed, optimized. We have turned it into a project, but strip all of that away. Go back 2,000 years to a limestone village in the hill country of Galilee. Go back to a world without antiseptic, without formula, without emergency rooms. Go back to a world where a woman who became pregnant did not know, could not know, whether she would survive the birth, where the infant she carried for 9 months might not live to see its first winter, where motherhood was not a chapter in a parenting book. It was a confrontation with the raw edge of existence itself. What did it actually feel like to be a mother in first-century Judea? What did those women carry? Not just in their bodies, but in their minds, their social standing, their fear. What happened when things went wrong, as they so often did? And what does it mean that Jesus of Nazareth, the figure at the center of the Christian faith, was born of such a woman, raised by such a woman, surrounded by such women throughout his entire ministry? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand the God who chose to enter the world through the body of a first-century Jewish mother. The village of Nazareth, in the time of Jesus, was not the town marked on tourist maps today. It was smaller, quieter, and far more precarious than anything that word, village, suggests in the modern imagination. Archaeologists estimate that it held somewhere between 200 and 400 people during the first century. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew everyone's business. The social fabric was tight, interwoven, and unforgiving of deviation. Houses were built from the same pale limestone that composed the hills themselves. Low ceilings, small windows, if there were windows at all. The interior of a typical Galilean home was a single room, sometimes divided by a low partition, where the family slept, cooked, ate, and kept their animals during cold nights. The floor was packed earth, sometimes plastered with lime. The walls absorbed the smell of smoke from the small clay oven, of wool and sweat, and animal dung, and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. In the morning, the light came in gray and horizontal through the doorway. In summer, the heat settled inside the stone walls and would not leave. This was the world into which a pregnant woman prepared to give birth. She did not prepare alone. That much is important to understand. The nuclear family, as we conceive of it today, isolated behind its own front door, was essentially foreign to first-century Galilean life. A woman giving birth would have been surrounded by the women of her extended family and her neighborhood. Her mother, her mother-in-law, her sisters, the older women of the village who had attended many births and who carried the collective knowledge of what to do when things went normally, and what to do when they did not. There were no licensed midwives in the modern sense, though experienced women filled that function. There were no forceps, no surgical interventions, no blood transfusions. If you find value in this kind of deep historical recovery, content that brings the biblical world to life in ways that reshape how we read Scripture, consider subscribing to this channel. This work takes time and care, and every subscriber makes it possible to keep going. The knowledge that circulated among these women was ancient, accumulated across generations. It was practical, specific, and serious. Certain herbs were boiled into teas to manage pain or encourage labor. Olive oil was used to ease delivery. Strips of linen were prepared for binding the newborn. The swaddling cloths that appear without explanation in the Gospel of Luke, familiar to any reader, but rarely understood in their full context. To swaddle a newborn was not merely a custom of comfort. It was believed to help the infant's limbs form correctly, to give structure to the new body, to signal care and intention. A child left unswaddled was a child left to chance. A child carefully bound was a child whose family had prepared, had invested, had declared their hope. That declaration of hope was itself an act of courage, because hope, in that world, was always shadowed. Infant mortality in the ancient world was devastating by any modern standard. Scholars estimate that somewhere between 20 and 30% of infants born in the Roman Empire during the 1st century died before their first birthday. By the age of 10, nearly half of all children born had died. These are not abstractions. These are the children of specific mothers, in specific houses, on specific nights, in a world where medicine could do very little and grief had no alternative but to continue living. A woman in 1st century Galilee who had given birth to 5 children might well have buried 2 or 3 of them. She carried those losses in her body, in the way she moved, in the way she held the surviving children a little tighter, in the way she lit the small oil lamp in the evening and watched the flame with an expression that had no name in any language. The grief was real, and it was normal. Not normal in the sense of acceptable or small, but normal in the sense of expected, woven into the texture of everyday life, absorbed into the rhythms of a world that did not offer the luxury of prolonged mourning. And yet, and this is important, those women were not broken by it. They were shaped by it. They were hardened and deepened and made capable of an endurance that the modern world, with all its protections, rarely has to summon. They were not victims of their circumstances. They were participants in a brutally demanding world, and they met it with the full force of who they were. Understanding this is not a footnote to the gospel story. It is the foundation of it. A girl in 1st century Galilee did not spend her childhood anticipating motherhood as a distant future event. She grew into it the way she grew into everything else, by watching, by doing, by absorbing the rhythms of the household from the time she could walk. By the age of 5 or 6, she was already helping her mother grind grain, fetch water, tend the fire. By 10, she understood the full cycle of bread, from the raw kernel soaked and dried and milled between 2 heavy stones, to the flat loaves baked on the clay surface of the tabern, the outdoor oven that sat in the courtyard or just outside the doorway of the house. The smell of that bread, slightly charred at the edges, dense with wheat or barley, was one of the defining sensory facts of her world. Water was another. The daily task of drawing water was not a small thing. In a village like Nazareth, the communal spring or cistern was the social and logistical center of female life. Women and girls came with large ceramic jars balanced on their heads or carried against their hips, and they came regularly, because water could not be stored indefinitely, because households consumed it constantly, because the jar itself was fragile and the distance was real. A broken jar on the way home was not merely an inconvenience. It was a loss of time, of energy, of the water already drawn. It meant the walk again. It meant arriving home later, with less, with the meal delayed and the children thirsty. Jesus knew this. When he stood in the temple courts and spoke of living water, when he sat beside a well in Samaria and spoke to a woman who had come alone at noon, at the hour when respectable women did not come, he was speaking from a world he had watched and understood his entire life. The weight of the jar was not a metaphor to him. It was a physical memory. A girl of 13 or 14 in this world was considered of marriageable age. The process by which she became a wife was governed not by her own preference, but by the negotiation between families, specifically between her father and the prospective groom or his family. The institution was called betrothal, and it was legally binding in a way that the modern concept of engagement is not. A betrothed woman was legally considered a wife, even though she had not yet moved into her husband's home and the marriage had not been physically consummated. To break a betrothal required a formal certificate of divorce. To betray a betrothal through sexual infidelity was treated, under Mosaic law, with the same severity as adultery in a fully consummated marriage. This is the legal and social framework within which Mary of Nazareth found herself when the Gospel of Luke opens its story. She was betrothed to a man named Joseph. She was young. The text does not give her age, but the cultural norm would suggest somewhere between 13 and 16. She had not yet moved into Joseph's home. She was still living in her father's household, in that transitional space between daughter and wife, when something happened that had no precedent, no social script, no category in the world she inhabited. She was pregnant, and Joseph was not the father. To read this story without understanding the social architecture of first-century Jewish life in Galilee is to miss almost everything about it. The stakes were not abstract. They were immediate, material, and lethal. A betrothed woman found pregnant by someone other than her betrothed husband faced, under the strictest reading of Deuteronomy, the possibility of death by stoning. Even if the community's response fell short of that extreme, and in Roman-occupied Galilee, where Jews had limited authority to carry out capital punishment, she faced certain social destruction. Her family faced shame. Her father faced the return of the bride price, the collapse of a carefully negotiated arrangement, the whispered judgment of every woman at the spring and every man at the village gate. Shame in the ancient Mediterranean world was not merely an emotion. It was a social force with material consequences. It determined who would trade with your family, who would give their daughter in marriage to your son, who would help you when your harvest failed or your roof needed repair. Honor and shame organized everything. To lose honor was not to feel bad. It was to lose the social infrastructure that kept you alive. Mary said yes. To what? To the visitation, to the pregnancy, to the role she was being asked to play in a story she could not fully comprehend. She said yes. And then she had to live in the world that came after that yes. Consider what that world looked like from the inside. She could not explain. There was no explanation that would be believed. The pregnancy was visible. It would become more visible. Joseph's response, described in Matthew's Gospel with careful restraint, reveals the human reality of the moment. He was, the text says, a righteous man, and not wanting to expose her to public disgrace, he planned to divorce her quietly. That phrase, quietly, carries enormous weight. It was not the response of a man unmoved. It was the response of a man trying to protect someone in a situation that, by every social and legal norm of his world, required a much harsher response. He was trying to find the most merciful available path within a system that had not been designed for mercy. And then he had a dream. The pivot in Matthew's account comes in a single night. Joseph woke up changed. He took Mary as his wife. He absorbed the shame. He stepped into a story that would cost him something. Socially, personally, in the eyes of the village that watched and remembered everything. These were not mythological figures operating outside the constraints of human life. They were a young woman and a young man in a small limestone village in occupied Galilee, navigating a situation that threatened everything they had, surrounded by people who would not understand and would not forget. The incarnation did not begin in a blaze of celestial glory. It began in exactly the kind of human difficulty that real people in real places have always faced. And a mother carried it forward, in her body, in her silence, in her yes. The journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem was approximately 90 miles. On foot, through the hill country of Judea, it took between 4 and 6 days. The road was not paved in the Roman sense. That infrastructure belonged to the major military and trade arteries, not to the routes traveled by ordinary Galilean families responding to a census decree. The path wound through terrain that was rocky, uneven, and exposed to weather. In winter, the nights in the Judean highlands dropped to temperatures that required fire and shelter. In the rainy season, the paths became treacherous with mud. Mary made that journey while 9 months pregnant. This detail passes quickly in the Gospel of Luke, almost without comment, because Luke's original audience would have understood its weight without needing it explained. They knew what such a journey cost a woman in the final weeks of pregnancy. They knew the pace would have been slow. They knew the physical demands, the back pain, the swollen feet, the difficulty of sleeping on the ground, the constant management of hydration and food in a landscape where resources were not guaranteed. They knew that a woman in that condition, on that road, was in a state of real physical vulnerability. Joseph would have carried what they needed: a water skin, some dried provisions, perhaps olives, dried figs, flatbread that would last several days without spoiling, a sleeping mat, a cloak thick enough to serve as a blanket. These were not romantic details. They were survival calculations. Every item carried had to justify its weight against the distance to be covered. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the famous problem of the inn presents itself, and here, too, the modern imagination has constructed an image that the historical evidence gently dismantles. The Greek word translated as inn in Luke's Gospel is kataluma, the same word used later in the Gospel to describe the upper room where Jesus shared his last meal with his disciples. It does not refer to a commercial roadside inn in the way the English word implies. It refers more likely to the guest room of a private home, the space in an extended family household set aside for visitors. Joseph, whose lineage was Davidic and whose family connection to Bethlehem was the entire reason for the journey, would have had relatives there. The kataluma was already full. The extended family household was already packed with others who had come for the same census. What was available was the lower level of the house, the space where the family's animals were kept at night, close to the main living area, both for security and for the warmth the animals provided. It was not a stable in the pictorial sense, not a separate wooden structure with a peaked roof and a star shining through the window. It was part of the house. Humble, yes. Private, in the way that mattered. Separated from the crowded guest room above. And in that space, among the breath and warmth of animals, on a night in a town she had not grown up in, surrounded by people she did not know well, Mary gave birth. The birth itself would have been attended by women. Even in an unfamiliar town, the network of female knowledge activated around a woman in labor. Someone would have known what to do. Someone would have had clean cloth or oil, or the herbs that helped. The practical emergency of a birth in progress mobilized the women present because that was how that world functioned. Collectively, immediately, without the need for instruction. Luke records that Mary wrapped the infant in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger. The manger, the feeding trough for animals, was not a metaphor. It was what was available. It was a stone or wooden basin, low to the ground, just deep enough to hold a wrapped infant securely. The swaddling cloths tell us she had prepared. She had brought them on the road, through the 90 miles, through the hills, against the possibility of exactly this moment. A mother preparing for birth, even in the most difficult circumstances, does not leave without the cloth for her child. That preparation is itself a portrait of who Mary was, not a passive figure in someone else's story, but a woman actively inhabiting her circumstances, making decisions, managing the physical reality of what her life had become. In the weeks after birth, the demands on a first-century mother did not ease. They intensified. Breastfeeding was not a choice or a preference. It was survival. Infant formula did not exist. Wet nurses were available to wealthy households, but for an ordinary Galilean family traveling far from home, the mother's body was the only source of nourishment for the newborn. The physical demands of nursing a newborn every few hours, while recovering from labor, while living in borrowed space in an unfamiliar town, while managing the anxiety of everything that had preceded this moment. These were the material conditions of the first days of Jesus' life on earth. Luke adds a detail that is easy to skip past. On the 8th day, the infant was circumcised and named. On the 40th day after birth, Mary went to the temple in Jerusalem for the rite of purification prescribed in Leviticus. And here, too, the economic realities surface quietly in the text. The prescribed offering for a woman's purification after childbirth was a lamb and a dove. But the law made provision for those who could not afford a lamb. 2 doves or 2 pigeons would suffice. Luke tells us that Mary and Joseph brought 2 birds, no lamb. This was not a minor detail. It was a disclosure of economic standing, written into the liturgical record, spoken aloud in the temple courts, by the act of offering what the poor were permitted to offer. The family of Jesus of Nazareth stood in the poor category, not in the sense of destitution, but in the precise legal and economic sense that the temple's own purity laws defined. They were among the many, not the few. They were among the people for whom a lamb was a thing to save for, not a thing to spend casually. And in that same temple, on that same day, an old man named Simeon took the infant in his arms and spoke words of prophecy over him, and then turned to Mary and said something that cut through all the warmth of the moment like cold air through an open door. "A sword," he said, "will pierce your own soul also." She was 40 days out from labor. She was still carrying the physical memory of the birth in her body. She had traveled 90 miles pregnant, given birth in a borrowed space, nursed her infant through the first weeks of his life on earth. And now an old man in the temple was telling her that suffering was coming. Not eventually, not vaguely, but specifically, directed at her. Inevitable. She heard it. She held it. And Luke, with his characteristic restraint, tells us that she treasured all these things in her heart. That phrase, treasured in her heart, appears twice in Luke's account of Jesus' early life. It is the description of a woman who could not fully explain what was happening around her, who did not have a theological framework adequate to contain her own experience, and who responded by holding it inward, carrying it carefully, the way you carry something fragile and irreplaceable through a world full of hard surfaces. This was the interior life of a first-century mother. Not sentiment, not serenity, endurance, attention, the daily labor of holding what cannot yet be understood. Jesus grew up watching his mother work. This is not a sentimental observation, it is a historical one, and it matters enormously for understanding where his teachings came from and why they landed with the force that they did. In a first-century Galilean household, the labor of women was not background noise. It was the operational center of daily survival. The grinding of grain, the baking of bread, the management of oil and water and fire, the mending of cloth, the preservation of food across seasons. These were not domestic extras. They were the mechanisms by which the family remained alive, fed, and functional from one week to the next. Jesus watched all of it. And then, when he began to teach, he reached into that watched world and pulled from it the images that would carry the weight of the kingdom of God. Consider the parable of the lost coin, recorded in Luke 15. A woman has 10 silver coins. She loses one. She lights a lamp, sweeps the entire house, searches carefully until she finds it. Then she calls her neighbors and friends together and says, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." To a modern reader, the parable can feel slightly charming, a small domestic drama used to illustrate a theological point about God seeking the lost. But in its first-century context, the coin was not a trivial thing. A silver drachma was equivalent to a full day's wage for a laborer. For a household operating at the margins, and most households in Roman-era Galilee were, losing a day's wage was not a minor inconvenience. It was a real crisis. It was the difference between purchasing enough grain for the week or going without. It was the kind of loss that stayed with you, that occupied your mind while you were doing other things, that made it impossible to rest until it was resolved. The woman in the parable does not shrug and move on. She cannot afford to. She lights the lamp, which itself costs oil, which itself costs money. And she sweeps every corner of the packed earth floor, moving methodically through the darkness of a house with small windows, searching the cracks and depressions in the ground where a small coin could easily disappear. The image Jesus chooses for the searching love of God is not an army mobilizing, not a king dispatching ambassadors. It is a woman on her knees in a dark house with a lamp, refusing to stop until she finds what she has lost. He had seen this. Not once, many times. He had seen his mother, or a neighbor woman, or a relative, doing exactly this. The theology was not invented in abstraction. It was drawn from the lived texture of a world he knew from childhood. The same is true of the parable of the yeast, also in Luke 13. A woman takes a small amount of leaven and works it into 3 measures of flour until all of it is leavened. The image seems simple, but 3 measures of flour, in the Greek, 3 sata, was approximately 40 liters of dough. An enormous quantity. The physical labor of working leaven through 40 liters of dough by hand, in a hot kitchen, was substantial. The woman in the parable is not performing a delicate culinary gesture. She is engaged in serious physical work, using her hands and her weight and her time, transforming raw material into something that will feed many people. And this, Jesus says, is what the kingdom of God is like. Not a dramatic intervention from above, but a slow, invisible physical process of transformation, worked by hand from the inside out. These teachings did not float down from the sky. They rose up from the courtyard, from the tabun, from the packed earth floor, where a woman knelt to search for a coin. They rose up from the hands of every mother who had ever fed a household with what she had, transformed scarcity into sufficiency through labor and knowledge, and refusal to give up. Mary lived through things that the gospel accounts record sparsely, but that the historical imagination can recover. She lived through the flight to Egypt, another journey, this one urgent and nocturnal, driven by the threat of Herod's violence against infant boys in the Bethlehem region. She left with a nursing infant and a husband and whatever they could carry, into a foreign country where the language was different, and the social networks she depended on did not exist. Egypt was not an adventure. It was exile. For a woman whose entire support structure, mother, sisters, neighbors, the women who had attended her birth, was back in Nazareth, Egypt was isolation on top of displacement, on top of fear. She lived through the years of ordinary life in Nazareth that followed. The years Luke summarizes in a single sentence. The child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom. Behind that sentence is a decade or more of daily motherhood. the feeding and clothing and protecting of a child who was, by every outward measure, simply a child who scraped his knees and needed to eat and grew out of his sandals and had to be called in from play when the evening meal was ready. Mary managed that ordinary life with the same hands that had wrapped him in swaddling cloths in a borrowed space in Bethlehem. She lived through the moment in Jerusalem when Jesus was 12 years old, and the family traveled to the temple for Passover, and on the return journey, she discovered that her son was not in the caravan. Luke records that she and Joseph searched for 3 days before finding him in the temple, sitting among the teachers. 3 days. For a mother, 3 days of not knowing where her child is, in a city full of strangers, is not a narrative device. It is anguish. When she found him, she said, and these are among the very few direct quotations of Mary's speech preserved in the Gospels, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." Anxiously. The Greek word is odunaomai. It carries the sense of pain, of grief, of a distress that occupies the whole body. This was not mild maternal concern. It was the full weight of 3 days of not knowing, resolved suddenly into relief, and then, almost immediately, into the disorientation of his answer. "Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Which Luke says they did not understand. She did not understand, and she held it anyway. She took what she could not comprehend and folded it into the interior space where she kept all the things that exceeded her grasp, treasured them in her heart, carried them forward. The last time the Gospels show Mary in proximity to Jesus during his public ministry, she is at a wedding in Cana, where the wine has run out. A social crisis in a culture where hospitality was a matter of family honor. She turns to Jesus and says simply, "They have no wine." It is not a request with an explanation attached. It is the statement of a woman who knows who she is speaking to and trusts that the statement alone is sufficient. He responds in a way that sounds, in translation, almost like a rebuke. But she does not wait for further negotiation. She turns to the servants and says, "Do whatever he tells you." It is her last recorded instruction in the Gospel of John. It is, in its quiet way, a masterpiece of maternal authority. Not the authority of control, but the authority of a woman who has spent 30 years watching, holding, enduring, and understanding something about this person that cannot be fully articulated. The next time the Gospels place her near him, he is on a cross. John records that she was there. Standing, the text says, not collapsed, not carried away, but standing at the foot of the cross, while her son died. The sword that Simeon had promised her in the temple, 40 days after his birth, had arrived. Whatever she had treasured in her heart across 30 years, the Annunciation, the manger, the flight, the temple, the wedding, the ministry she had watched from a distance, she carried all of it into that hour and stood upright beneath the weight of it. There is no record of what she said. There may have been nothing to say. There are moments of human suffering that exceed the reach of language, that exist in a register below words, in the body, in the standing, in the refusal to leave. Jesus, from the cross, saw her. He entrusted her to the care of the beloved disciple. It was a practical provision. A widowed woman in first-century Jewish society had no legal standing outside of her relationship to a male relative. He was ensuring that she would not be left without protection or provision. Even in the final hours of his life, the material conditions of a woman's survival in that world were being attended to. This is the world the Gospels were written from, not from abstraction, not from a place beyond human suffering, from the interior of a world where mothers buried children and searched dark floors for lost coins and stood at crosses and held what they could not understand. The God who chose to enter human history chose to enter it through exactly this kind of life. Fragile, costly, carried by a woman who said yes before she understood what yes would require, and who never stopped saying it. Faith in the Gospels does not begin with doctrine. It begins with a mother wrapping her child in cloth she had carried 90 miles through the Judean hills, laying him in the only available space, and staying.